Somebody said the other
title
day.
Sponsor. There's our title sponsor for today,
Yay!
Raina.
Hey, Raina.
Hi.
Okay, well, I'm going to get started while everybody's still logging in. Welcome, everyone. I'm Cindy DeWeese, the President and CEO of the Clear Lake Area Chamber of Commerce. And again, it's so nice to see your faces, and thanks for joining us. As we get started, I want you to know we want you to keep your cameras on today. So, but please be sure to mute yourself as we get started with the program. I'd also like to recognize some folks that have joined us before we get started. Of course, our Chairman of the Board, Sean Bailey with Amico Federal Credit Union. Hi, Sean. Happy to have you with us.
Thank you.
And then our State Representative, Dennis Paul, that we all heard from a minute ago. So hi, Dennis. Thanks for joining us. And then Dr. Ira Blake with U of H Clear Lake is on with us today. So thank you so much, Dr. Blake, for being here. Also, if you have some questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to use the chat feature. We'll be monitoring that. Or you can email Sherry Sweeney, the Chamber Vice President, at Sherry, S-H-A-R-I, at clearlakearea.com. Again, S-H-A-R-I at clearlakearea.com. Now I want to welcome our Chair-elect, Bob Davey with Greer, Hertz, and Adams. Bob, take it away.
Well, thank you, Cindy, and thank everyone for joining us today. I mean, we're talking to the comptroller who's going to have a pretty important position coming. But first, I have the pleasure of recognizing today's meeting sponsor, Shell Federal Credit Union. Anyone who lives, works, worships, attends school, or regularly conducts business in Harris County can bank with Shell Federal Credit Union once a $5 savings account is established for membership. All 10 branches are open. They're all continuing to practice social distancing to protect their members and staff by inquiring about the service request prior to anyone entering the building and asking everyone to wear a mask. Drive-through call centers and electronic services all continue to be available. Now through September, the Shell FCU member referral promotion is back. New members will receive $50 when a current member refers them, and the member will earn $25. $250 cash back on all new, used, and refinanced auto loans. There you go. $500 cash back on all new and refinanced mortgage loans. Plus, you'll be entered to win $2,500. Make sure to visit www.shellfcu.org and follow them on social media at Shell FCU on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And let me thank you, Shell, on behalf of the Chamber and all its members for supporting our community and the Chamber's initiatives as a sponsor here today. Let's give them a round of applause or wave. All right. Now, I also have the pleasure of introducing today's speaker, Texas Comptroller Glenn Hegar. Glenn is a sixth generation Texan who grew up farming land that had been in his family since the mid-1800s. That goes way back. He's a 1993 graduate of Texas A&M University. He went on to earn his JD or Juris Doctor from St. Mary's University, as well as a Master of Laws from the University of Arkansas. Glenn has served in the Texas legislature where he worked on issues including public ed, transportation, tax reform, government transparency, Second Amendment rights, water issues, and tort reforms. As controller, Glenn is chief financial officer for the world's 10th largest economy. We sometimes forget that, but that's impressive. He has emerged as a passionate advocate for conservative financial management and government transparency, who is focused on creating a more efficient and customer-oriented agency. He founded the state's Transparency Stars program. He's pushed for smarter ways of investing our rainy day fund for its future generations, which may be important now, and guided the formation of the nation's first ever state-administered precious metals depository. Hegar's upbringing taught him the core values of hard work, honesty, and integrity, the same values he and his wife Dara worked to instill in their three young children, Claire, Julia, and Jonah. Hegar's most important title throughout his years of service is the one closest to home, Dad. So let's welcome Texas Comptroller Glenn Hegar.
Good to be with y'all today. Like Representative Paul, wish we could be there in person. Unfortunately, we're still in this COVID situation. And let me kind of flash back a little bit, which was just in February, even though I think for all of us, the last couple of months seems almost like hundreds of years, if not 1,000 years. So it's been a slow several months, but regardless, if you go back to February of this year, we had here in Texas had about 50,000 job gains, over 300,000 job gains in the prior 12 months. My office, as y'all may recall, is in addition to the tax collection portions of business of the state, in addition to running the state treasury, we also are constantly looking at the state's economy across all 12 economic regions, 254 counties, essentially trying to make sure that we can keep the legislature and the public informed of the health of the state economy. And we close out our fiscal years at the end of August and start a new fiscal year September 1. And so starting a few months ago through this time of the year, we look at cash flow needs for the state of Texas in the next fiscal year. Also, whether there should be adjustments in revenues. And back in February, we had revenues tracking slightly above what we had estimated last year. So my point being is, as we all know, the economy was in very good shape in February. And then unfortunately, two different impacts to our state economy, as we all know, occurred in March. One, at the early part of March, Russia and Saudi Arabia could not agree on reductions in production for oil. And unfortunately, Saudi Arabia also, with a very untimely announcement, decided to increase production. So that in itself seemed as though that would impact Texas, obviously more, say, in the Permian Basin, as well as more in the Houston area than other regions of the state, even though Texas is much more diverse as an economy than we were in the 1980s and 90s. Unfortunately, that impacted one major industry sector, which oil was already under some type of stress from a financial standpoint, just because having a little more difficulty being able to get either bank loans and or private equity into the shale areas. And we were seeing some decrease in sales tax numbers already in the mining or oil and gas industry coming into the state treasury before that standpoint. The point being is that untimely announcement seemed as though some regions of the state may have some type of recessionary impact. Now the question whether that would impact the whole state. Now, obviously we had been tracking what was going on across the world, because as you may recall, Texas is 19% of all exports out of the United States. So we are very much fundamentally tied to the global economy. And so therefore what is happening in other countries, regardless of whether Texas and the United States was going to somewhat of a social distancing and a shutting down of portions of the economy to deal with COVID, those impacts across the rest of the world was going to be some headwinds in ourselves here in the state economy. And then obviously, as we went to social distancing in the middle of March, I decided it was very, even before that standpoint, to get out and talk about that we had no doubt Texas was going to have some type of recession. The question was how deep, how wide, and how long, which again, at this point, we're still really just don't know all of that information because there's so much data that's coming in. We started looking at what we call non-traditional economic indicators, just because from a revenue standpoint, those of you that may not recall, the collections that we have coming into the state treasury right now for sales tax, for example. And the reason I say more about sales tax than other revenue streams, just as a refresher, of the state budget, 1/3 is federal dollars, 2/3 is state dollars. Of the 2/3 state dollar portion, obviously the biggest piece is tax collections, and roughly about 58% of all tax collections is sales tax. And another 8% is motor vehicle sales and rental taxes. So that's the reason I talk a lot about sales tax, because that really impacts the health of the state economy drastically, whether it's upside or downside. And so anyway, we started looking at a lot of non-traditional data points, because in May, right now, the revenues that I have being sent to me by businesses were for collections in April. Same, for example, last month, April collections were really what they collected in March. And so therefore there's a 30-day lag, and reason being, just making the point, we started looking at non-traditional data points just because there's a lag in the data to be able to see how deep was the impact here in the state of Texas. First, we started looking at open table. Well, however, we had to throw that out the window pretty quick, because as we went to social distancing, open table reservations for restaurants essentially went to zero. We started looking at TSA Travel data, as we all know, flights are being shut down across not just the United States, but across the world. It's not a data point that we ever looked at, but just to those of you that may not know, there's roughly about 2.3 million people that travel through airports on a given average in the United States every day. At one point in time here a month ago, there were about 90,000 people flying around the United States. So imagine going from 2.3 million to 90,000. Now that has rebounded somewhat, but when I say rebounded, it's de minimis really, because now the average last week was 200,000. So a little over 200,000, really about 250,000 people compared to 2.3 million. It's rebounded some, but not significant. If we look at our hotel industry, for example, occupancy rate today is 32%. At one point, it was as low as 21%. One of the points that we look at the box office, essentially those going to watch movies, roughly in a given week, depending on, there's a little about 200 million plus that is brought in revenues and box offices. Last week, it was 200,000. In the first few weeks, it was a little over $5,000 compared to $250 million that consumers spend in box offices. And the irony is the second most populous movie that first or second week of COVID was a documentary. It was called Portland, Oregon. And actually the second highest grossing movie in that week in the United States was $24. I think they sold like 3 tickets. And so, it just puts in comparison of how deep we were at and where we're at today. So obviously the economy to some degree is rebounding. In my office, there's a lot of data and a lot of people, a lot of economists. I was reading an article right before I got on this. What do economists think? Is this a V-shaped recovery? Is it more of a U-shaped recovery? Is it a W-shaped recovery? In other words, do we have another round of COVID type infections in the fall, this winter time? No one really knows the answers to that. We don't think, and we've been saying from the beginning, we don't think this is a V-shaped recovery, because when you have a record number of people file for unemployment, and for example, most of you may have seen in Texas, that's about 2 million people. In the United States, it's 39 million people. And just to make a point, in 1982, the most number of people that ever filed for unemployment in the United States was in 1982 in one given week, and that was 695,000 people. The first week of COVID social distancing, those that are either in the restaurant business, bars, leisure, hospitality, the travel industry, were the people that were retail, were the ones most immediately impacted. And that first week, filing of unemployment was 3.3 million. The next week was 6.8 million, 6.5, and it has gone down. But the point being is, looking at unemployment numbers, this is not going to be a quick recovery. Now, it will look like it's a quicker recovery as we're moving into the upcoming quarters, because of the low now we're compared ourselves to. So, what I've been cautioning to members of the legislature and the public, Texas entered into this with a stronger base from an economic standpoint than other states. I have a call later today with the other 49 treasurers across the nation, and listening to them originally in the very first beginning of this made me greatly appreciate that I get to say that I live in Texas, because the financial situation of the state is much healthier than other states. However, we're still going to have significant issues. As the legislature gets back into session, they will have an economic stabilization fund or a rainy day fund or a state savings account of about $8.5 billion. There's been a significant amount of money from the federal government that has gone to the 50 states, in addition to other dollars the federal government has spent. So how we spend those COVID dollars, as they're supposed to be spent on COVID type related expenses, but the Treasury's given pretty broad parameters, but you have to document and make sure you document very well when the federal auditors show up here in a few years that you're spending it in COVID related, but the Treasury gave some pretty broad discretion for the states. And so therefore the point being is, we're trying to look at all the economic data that we can, look at prior events, whether it was the Great Financial Crisis, whether it was 9/11, none of those events are exactly similar to the one that we have here in Texas. Obviously it was a lot more fun doing my job back in February and the months prior to that than right now, trying to give, unfortunately, not very good economic data. One of the points, just to put in perspective, even though we had a historically low unemployment in Texas of about 3.4% before these twin events happened. It was in, oil prices going down, mostly in part originally because of the lack of agreement between Russia and Saudi Arabia, Saudi increasing production, but also because of COVID, 30% less consumption across the entire world as people are not driving, people are not flying, the usage is not there of what it was. And so there, from a supply demand, an oversupply and not the demand. And then in addition to the COVID and social distancing and shutting down on portions of the economy, now instead of having 3.4% unemployment, we have roughly about 13.7% as of last week. To put that in comparison, of the 50 states in the United States, as well as the District of Columbia, we're ranked 46th. So in other words, as bad as 13.7% is, Texas actually is in significantly better shape. And when I say that, it's even hard to put that in perspective because other states are in much worse shape than Texas is my point. And so, that's really not a consolation prize. It's just trying to put a comparison. Thankfully, we entered this with a strong economy. We do think it'll take a while for us to get back to pre-COVID economic essentially levels where we were. Some of the things that we've done in my office from a tax perspective, a lot of businesses were obviously hurting in the original beginning. Some people had asked me, Glenn, would you essentially waive having businesses send in, say, for example, their sales tax receipts for up to 90 days? Because I have the authority during a disaster declaration. Say, for example, when there's a hurricane. We all know in the areas that we call home, we have hurricanes, there's major disruptions in the economy. And during that disaster declaration, I can waive those businesses filing in or paying for up to 90 days. However, this event is not just a few regions, one region of the state and a few counties, it's all 254 counties. So in analyzing, trying to make a decision, and again, I couldn't isolate and just say, oh, well, we're just gonna apply this to restaurants, we're just gonna apply this to hotels. We'd have to apply it to every industry sector. And so the decision was made that it's more work on our part, but to do a case-by-case basis for each business that needed that time. Essentially, we would give them an extra period of time, but we highly encourage them to essentially, one, file their tax reports, number two, make a down payment, because in part, those dollars are collected from you and I, the taxpayers, and they're holding that in trust for the state, as well as when I collect those dollars, then I send it back to 1,633 local jurisdictions for the local sales tax portion. And I didn't feel like it was very prudent on my behalf to make a decision for 1,633 local jurisdictions with a blanket waiver across the state of Texas. Obviously, we delayed franchise tax payments until July of this year to give businesses more time. So we've been trying to work more so on a case-by-case basis with businesses than really trying to do a blanket approach. And so with that being said, I'll stop right there. Happy to start having questions, comments, complaints. If you got too many complaints, I see Dennis is still on the call, so I know he's happy to take complaints, and he's given a thumbs up even. So he's ready to help.
Well, I can ask a question if nobody else or while others are cogitating questions. I guess, first of all, will you be updating your official revenue forecast? And if so, when?
Yeah, great question. And we decided very early on, made an announcement that I was going to update that in July of this year. And the reason being is that that corresponds with us doing our cash flow analysis for what we need from a cash flow perspective, starting in September of this year for the next fiscal year. Some people have asked, should the legislature come into a special session? I typically answer no. One, it's hard during social distancing for them to get in a special session. Two, as a former legislator in the House and the Senate, it's very difficult for them to agree to something in 30 days in a special session. That's what a special session is committed to. And then thirdly, from a cash flow perspective, with a large economic stabilization fund or state savings account, we're able to cash flow. So we do that cash flow analysis in part because, a reminder, we send as a policy and have for almost 40 years now, send local school districts roughly 50% of their school funding in September, October, and November. So That essentially means a cash flow issue for the state with a deepest hole in our revenues coming in and expenditures going out for that first week in December. And then lastly, most importantly, I said we would do it in July in part because we wanted a couple of months of data coming into the Treasury to be able to base a forecast off of. And so therefore right now everybody has just very lack of data that's coming in to be able to make a real revenue forecast. And so that's the reason I said we do it in July. I didn't want to do it immediately because back in the 1980s, the Comptroller's Office put a new revenue estimate out without real good data. The next month they had to do another one. The third month they had to do a third one. The fourth month they had to do a fourth one. And essentially each one got a little worse, and it just made it seem as though the picture was worse than it was. And so therefore that's the reason I've said July. But just to put in perspective, last month sales tax receipts were down 9.3% compared to the same month of April of last year. We had motor vehicle sales receipts were down 45%. That is the largest going back to 1983. If hotel receipts were down 63%, that is the largest going back to 1990. And then alcohol receipts were down 55%. And I know some of you may be shaking your head and thinking, well, you've done your part. You know, you've either continued to have, I see some heads. I'm not going to call anybody out, but I see a few heads moving there. And I'll tell you, I enjoy a bourbon in the afternoon. You know, a very strenuous day. Looking at all this data makes you a little not too great. So I'm doing my part too. But the reason we've had 55% decrease is because most of that is based off mixed beverage sales. And so with restaurants and bars that have closed, that's where the bulk of the receipts come in. And so most of the numbers, I feel like this month will probably be worse for most of those. And the reason being is because when we collected revenues last month, again, that was for March, and March was only part of a month for social distancing. Whereas the collections we're having this month was for April, and that was a full month of social distancing. And just kind of put in perspective, in the great financial crisis, we saw immediately the next month motor vehicle sales dropped. Also after 9/11, hotel receipts dropped immediately. However, after the great financial crisis, there was about a 6-month lag before we started seeing negative numbers in sales tax receipts because it took a while for those ripples to fill in the economy. But we've made a point. Those ripples are going to be felt immediately with so many portions of the economy even shut down and businesses are not able to do their normal operations. However, we're also seeing obviously disruptions where people, they may not be going to the restaurant, but they're actually, you know, buying more groceries or they're spending dollars in different manners. And so trying to figure out how does that match up, and then how does that match up? Because even if you're spending a dollar in a different venue, that doesn't mean that it's actually taxed on the same level. So it does cause also disruptions even if people, but in times like this, consumer spending goes down because consumer savings goes up. So we know that's why we think in part it'll be more prolonged than immediate recovery. So that's a longer answer to your question, but I wanted to fill in a couple other pieces there on some other issues as well.
Hey, Glenn, there's a lot of rumors, but it could be a really good boon for Texas. But what are you hearing about Elon Musk moving facilities to Texas?
Yeah, I haven't heard anything specific as to that. I know, you know, I'll say it in this frame, is that if you look over the course of the last 2 and 3 years, say for example, and it's been a while since I've looked at this data point, but I have my staff just look at press clippings, which would really mean big businesses such as Elon and his business moving to Texas. I think if I recall correctly, businesses setting up new locations in Texas or moving their headquarters here, there was almost 50,000 job gains in an 18-month period throughout last year, and half of the year before is about $10 billion of investment in the state of Texas. One of the states that most of those people were moving from is where? California. And so therefore, you know, the point being is what I'm getting at. I don't know specific on that business. However, I would say the trend has been, and on with a real estate group the other day, I was on a call just talking about what we thought the market was doing and where we would be in office space and retail space, for example. And one of the points that they were making and trying to ask if we saw any indication of this, which I said it was really too early to see. But the question was, are people wanting to even more move to Texas for an economic opportunity and relocate than some other states? And, you know, that has been the trend is my point. and that trend will probably continue. Just the question is how quick do we get back to where we were, or is there an acceleration? I don't know, but that's a great question. I think businesses will continue to want to relocate. One, we're a more youthful population than most other states and most other countries, so you have a workforce for the future. We're a more affordable place than most other states and most other places, so therefore, from a business standpoint, and then two, from a taxation or regulation standpoint, Texas is a little more friendly. But I think this unfortunately circumstance that we found ourselves in, we need to also at the state level, like we're all doing it in our personal lives and our businesses, is reevaluate how we go about doing business. And we also need to reevaluate some of the rules and regulations to make sure that businesses are able to continue to operate and do what they do best, create jobs.
Well, I have a question. This is Sean Bailey with Amico Federal Credit Union. I want to first say we just got off the phone with Congressman Weber, and I just want to say God bless Texas and the way that we manage our state affairs compared to the struggles that are going on the federal level right now. So appreciate all your efforts there. And I also wanted to say, unfortunately, this is not our first rodeo. We've had other incidents, not at this level, but you mentioned several in the past. But educate us and help us educate our membership on what are some of the options that you will be exploring and some of the options that we may have to educate our peers and others about as opposed to hearing it in the press.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, we need to make sure that as we open up the economy, getting people back to work, I have a concern that unfortunately, I was on a call earlier today, and one of the points was some data and how do we push data out to make sure that people can see what is really happening. And so, for example, I think that you have a significant number of people that are a little overly concerned and changing behavior substantially compared to where they were before. Say, for example, just last week, you'd see headlines saying that Texas has the largest increase that we've had in the past several weeks as the economy is opening up and COVID type related cases. But that's a catchy headline to get you to click. But once you start looking in the data, well, that's one or two isolated events. Is that unfortunately, which has been a struggle across so much of the nation, of dealing with our retirement communities and nursing home facilities, or whether it's meat packing plants, facilities where people are tightly compact, where our air is recirculated and or not being outdoors. And so the point being is you have to put it in perspective of what is going on. And so I think, unfortunately, we need to make sure that people are well educated. As you get outdoors and air circulation, that's not a load impact that it will deal with if you're in tight confined spaces, and trying to make sure the right information is out there. And also, as the point that I've tried to continue to make is that, yes, this is a very unfortunate event that we've had, not just in Texas, not just in the United States, but worldwide. However, fortunately, that Texas entered this in a stronger position than many other states did. And I think, as to the question earlier, Texas is going to continue to outpace the national average from an economic perspective, as we have almost year after year. However, I do think it's going to be a little bit longer lag before we get there. And the reason I say that is only because not only are we dealing with COVID, but also as a portion of the state's economy is based on oil and gas, not to the level it used to be, but certain regions, that's going to take a longer time period to be able to straighten out and have an increase, and then be in 19% of the global economy from exports out of the United States, that is. And so therefore, my point being is I think we're probably not going to outpace the national average for the immediate future, but we're poised to regain that in the upcoming future. And one of the things I would just say as kind of a question to the group, and I say this to everybody, obviously, if we look at job gains in any economy, it's small businesses. Small businesses are the economic engine for creativity, for job gains, and as different people are having issues in their businesses or seeing issues, whether my office can directly help or not is one issue, but another one is to make sure that we're aware. And, we're asking for any type of information or stories because, we're in constant communication with leadership, as well as you were having a conversation with Congressman Weber, to be able to make sure that policymakers have the right information to be able to make sure that, we're able to get the economy going back as quickly as possible, because most importantly, to help small business and all businesses. But the point being is that's where the jobs are created.
let me ask one other question. The chamber's made up of a whole bunch of disparate businesses and business sectors. And as the comptroller, you look at a lot of different business sectors. But of those business sectors, do you have a perception of the hardest hit and a perception of those that need to be up and running fastest to pull the rest of us along?
Yeah, I think the ones that are hardest hit are, number one, those that are in the tourism, and not necessarily in this order, but as a group. The tourism industry significantly hit. Retail, going to box stores is significantly hit. If you have an online presence, that may be a different story. Whether it's grocery stores have done better than obviously restaurants and bars. So those are areas that are significantly hit. Say, for example, if you look at the state of Texas, I've made a point that in San Antonio, portions of Austin, because it's much more tourism industry based than other portions of the state, that they're going to see a little bit greater lag in some economic recovery, at least as far as that industry sector. Obviously, if when I was down at NASA last year, I was making the point that we have over 1 million people that go through NASA every single year from out of state. But obviously, as people are trying to decide, are they going to move around? Are they going on summer vacation, not going on summer vacation? That's going to impact the numbers and the visibility. Just to use that as an example that's in our backyard. I do think that Congress has talked about having a package that is related specifically to construction. I think that's something that's extremely important. One of the things we've looked at is dollars going to the Department of Transportation, a little bit of money. Roughly this year, this fall, we felt as though we would move over to our state savings account about $1.6 billion and a $1.6 billion over to TxDOT from severance tax collections from the oil and gas industry. However, the rapid deterioration in the industry means that we think each fund, instead of getting $1.6 billion, is going to be getting roughly about $1 billion. So that's $600 million less that's going to go to transportation because of decrease in oil and gas. And so, what we've been trying to look at, and also motor vehicle sales, the gas tax, those have gone down. But fortunately, from a gas tax perspective, with all the 18-wheelers and vehicles still moving around, that's decreased, but not to the same level. And so the point being is it's really important to continue to have those construction jobs. But one of the areas that I do have big concerns about, and I flagged this in my letter to leadership at the end of last month when we gave them the financial numbers of decreases in revenue streams. I made the point that when they come back into session next year, when property values are assessed on January 1, that I have a concern that you're going to see values decrease in some areas. We don't know to what level in the retail sector, because you have a significant number of retailers and major retailers that are filing for bankruptcy and announcing that they're going to close numerous offices across the country. I don't know specifically about here in Texas, but the point is there will be ripple effects. And then also in the commercial space, because businesses are figuring out, just like my office, I have 3,000 employees, and hardly any of my employees have been back in the office since the middle of March. And so therefore, we're not going to flip the light switch on and bring them all back immediately. It'll be phased in over time, but also we're going to have much more teleworking than what we have in the past. It's something that I've been pushing for several years, just because I felt like, people would, rather than be stuck in traffic, have the opportunity so many days a week to work from home and increase productivity. And so therefore, my point being, I think there'll be a little bit more of a lag of impact in the commercial space as offices may not renew their leases to the level that they did before. But I'm a little concerned in what that's going to happen in those two markets.
Mr. Hager, I have a question. This has to do with what you said about small businesses being the economic engine for the state, or for the nation, actually. So what I want to ask is, what role do you think higher ed can play in strengthening them post-pandemic and for future economic crises?
Yeah, I think number one, we need to look at, from a government perspective, how do we do things smarter and better to give flexibility? A lot of people, as I was just mentioning just a moment ago, January 1 is the date upon which property values are assessed. Now, unfortunately, with COVID happening in March, the bulk of the economic impact of COVID is for 3/4 of the year of the fiscal year. However, people's values were locked back in January 1. And so there, I think the legislature will have to look at next session. Is there a different approach that we're going to take? Because not only did people see their values increase, but then obviously they've had disruptions to their paychecks, disruptions to their businesses. I mean, that's just one example to reevaluate what we've done in the past and how do we deal with these types of events in the future. So I think there's a lot of things that government's going to have to reevaluate, just like we are in our personal lives, just like we are in our own businesses, and then also trying to have greater flexibility to deal with businesses on a one-on-one basis and or selectively. And one thing, as I was asked just a minute ago, that reminded me we transition, another industry sector that it's just, to me, it's unfortunate how ironic this is. The effort to social distance across the entire world to save the healthcare system has in fact, unfortunately, caused significant revenue disruptions to the healthcare system, because in essence, by having people not come in for certain procedures, essentially the entire healthcare system has been locked down to some degree as well, to make sure that there were beds available for those that needed to come in, that need ventilation systems as a result of COVID and just for hospital cares. However, we've seen significant layoffs and furloughs in the healthcare industry throughout the entire United States, throughout the world, because the revenue streams are not there what they used to be. And so that's something that I think is first and foremost on my concern. And that's not just, say, for example, because more counties than not in Texas are rural. And so therefore making sure you have rural healthcare, but also in suburban, urban areas, to make sure that we've got to figure out a way that we don't disrupt the healthcare system like we have anymore, and make sure that our doctors and nurses can get back to work.
Well, do I see any more questions? Bob, did you have any other questions?
It looks like Glenn's wowed everybody here.
He's given us some great information, hasn't he?
When you give a good full report, it eats up the questions.
Great.
Well, I want to say thank you again for what all y'all do. I appreciate everybody and what you contribute here to the state economy, and everybody's working hard, not just from a business perspective, but in the community. And I have one of the sayings I tell people in my office is that it takes everybody to row the boat. It takes everybody to get what we have here in the state of Texas, and to continue for economic opportunity and prosperity, not just from a business perspective, but more so in a community. And I know everybody that's on here today loves the community that you call home, loves the state of Texas. And I just want to say thank you for what you do, because that's part of the reason Texas has had such a strong economy. This is because of people who are on this Zoom call today. And I just want to say thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being with us today. We appreciate you. We appreciate your leadership in our great state of Texas. We are a great state, and we're all gonna get back to better very soon, I feel like. So thank you for being with us. And thanks everybody for being on the call. We appreciate you tuning in today. We're gonna get back together in person really soon, and the comptroller is gonna join us soon again in person, I hope. So tomorrow, I just want to have a few announcements I want to remind you of. Tomorrow, we have a virtual business after hours at 4 o'clock with a little bit of a twist. We're going to want to make sure that everybody has a short commercial available and ready to go, because everybody will have an opportunity to share about your business. But there's more. We're going to have a little summer spirit. We're encouraging you to wear your best luau attire then you either hat or clothes or lei or whatever you want to do, and then put Island Oasis virtual background behind you. Unless you have your own Island Oasis that you can just share with everybody and sit in front of. But if you have one of those backgrounds, that would be great. Several of our restaurants are going to show us how to prepare some fancy favorite drinks. And so please RSVP today. Login information will be sent to you. So I think you'll enjoy that. Also, just stay tuned for next week. We have our business development seminar on Tuesday the 2nd at 10 a.m. And the topic is going to be transition to greatness. Don't we all need to hear about that? Returning to work after the shutdown with Sharon Baez with Innovative Alternatives. Sharon has a great program, and I think we'll all enjoy that. And then mark your calendars next month, June 24th. June is already here. The general membership luncheon will feature our CCISD superintendent, Greg Smith. So we'd like for you to all join us for that as well. Be sure and check our events calendar and on clearlakearea.com and register and check for programs and events there. So thank you again, Shell Federal Credit Union. Raina, are you still on? You are still on. I see your lovely face. So thank you so much for sponsoring today's meeting. And if you are interested in sponsoring, please let us know. We would appreciate that very much. Hope you all have a great rest of the day. And I hope to see you tomorrow at the Business After Hours, today's general membership. So Business After Hours tomorrow, 4 o'clock. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.